What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. I am back from vacation, so what that means is more Let's Talk Dynasty, fresh content, more content, and actually a lot more content because we are now about to move to 5 videos per week starting July 1st. So it'll be Monday through Friday that we are putting out new content. But today, for Let's Talk Dynasty, we are going to be talking about some ambiguous wide receiver rooms, some sketchy situations in Dynasty Fantasy Football, trying to make sense of these wide receiver rooms. So War and I, we are going to make sense of them for you, give you guys our 2 cents so you can come to your own conclusions as well. But like you know, I already mentioned it, it would not be Let's Talk Dynasty without my co-host. So let's bring him into the building and let's start talking about some of these wide receiver rooms. War, how you doing, man?
MFG in the building, man. I'm doing good, man. Glad you back from vacation, ready to get rolling.
Hell yeah, man. And today's is going to be quite a show because I feel like we both spent some time researching. I know I spent some time trying to figure out some of this stuff, so I'm excited to see what your research says. But I think we shouldn't waste any more time. We should just hop right into it because we have 10 rooms to talk about today. And we're going to be starting with the Buffalo Bills and more specifically, what to do at their wide receiver 2 position. Because right now, there is an argument about Khalil Shakir or Curtis Samuel. And when you look at these guys and you look at their ADPs right now, on Keep Trade Cut, Khalil Shakir, he is currently the wide receiver 62. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 61 over on Sleeper. And then Curtis Samuel, he is the wide receiver 69 on Keep Trade Cut, being drafted as the wide receiver 74 on Sleeper. So right now, Khalil Shakir is above Curtis Samuel. And I want to know your opinions. Do you believe that this is the right choice? Do you think this is the way that this wide receiver room should be?
Yes, I'm actually a very big Khalil Shakir guy. Khalil Shakir ended the season on a high note with Gabe Davis out. And he's actually the 137th ranked player on Pro Football Focus and the 58th ranked wide receiver. In contrast, he's the 169th player on Fantasy Pros and a number 70 wide receiver. Believe it or not, on Pro Football Focus, Curtis Samuel is just one spot above Khalil Shakir, which I don't agree with. I just think that he's younger. He has a better chance of more development. And I think that he did very well towards the end of the season to where he should at least be given a nod over Curtis Samuel. I understand that Curtis Samuel is expected to do some more of that hybrid role where he's like doing a little bit rushing. He gives you more rushing upside. I just think in general, though, that Khalil Shakir has more upside than Curtis Samuel.
I mean, just looking at Khalil Shakir's season last year, 39 receptions, 611 yards, had 7.1 fantasy points per game, which was good for wide receiver 68. So like you said, it wasn't like the full season. The full sample size wasn't everything that you wanted. But the end of the year when Gabe Davis was out, he kind of came on. And I think they really leaned on him, especially in the playoffs as well. When you saw that Buffalo Bills team kind of trying to make a push, it seemed like Khalil Shakir stepped up. He was kind of the guy when Stefon Diggs was failing us for our fantasy football teams. He wasn't putting up the numbers we wanted. Shakir was. But I will say, this is one of the ones that we disagree on because I do think that Curtis Samuel, for me, he's the wide receiver that I would like to invest in. I mean, I just look at how Curtis Samuel is utilized and I look at the success that he has by route. And you know, I'm a big fan of Matt Harmon. I know Matt Harmon's reception perception is kind of the gold standard for wide receivers right now in fantasy football. And this is a guy who has a lot of green on that chart. I'm going to throw it up on the screen in the edit so everyone can see it, but there's a lot of green on this chart. And you look at how he was used in 2023. He had the 12th highest amount of slot snaps. I expect him to kind of be that security blanket for Josh Allen with a Keon Coleman and a Khalil Shakir on the outsides. And that may mean that in 2 wide receiver sets, Samuel is coming off the field, but you hear kind of how Brandon Beane and you hear how Joe Brady talk about Curtis Samuel right now. Joe Brady said that they need more Curtis Samuels on this football team if they want to be a good football team. So big stamp of approval. Obviously, he coached him back when they were in Carolina. And you also look at the success rates that he had when he was in Washington last year. 82nd percentile versus man, 66th versus zone, 57th versus press. But that man coverage success rate, that's something that I think is going to be highly successful for a guy like Curtis Samuel in this offense with Josh Allen. And we know about all of the vacated targets that have left town. Stefon Diggs, Gabe Davis, we don't need to talk too much about that. Yeah. But the reality is, I just think that there's a lot of opportunity, and Curtis Samuel has kind of that role where you can plug him in anywhere, and he's probably going to find his way. I think this is not me putting a stamp of dislike on Khalil Shakir, but
Right,
the
right.
fact that on Keep Trade Cut and in your sleeper drafts, you are getting Curtis Samuel cheaper. I think when it's a little bit ambiguous like this, I'll take the guy who I think I've seen kind of perform at a higher level at times, where even last year we saw Curtis Samuel averaging 9.8 fantasy points per game. I'll just take that guy at a cheaper rate and see what happens, because I think there's a real chance that Curtis Samuel could lead this team in targets here in 2024.
Yeah. Now I don't want to put a stamp of disapproval on Curtis Samuel either, because I think that with Joe Brady there, he actually will perform well. Mine is more so from the perspective of an age perspective of how young Khalil Shakir is, and it's also just the fact that I'm not a huge believer in Keon Coleman. So I mean, those two things go into play. So if Keon Coleman doesn't perform, then Khalil Shakir will have that opportunity to step up and actually have even bigger role than originally expected. But I do like the idea of how Curtis Samuels will be used in the Buffalo Bill offense.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're this late in your drafts, we're talking about wide receiver 60 and wide receiver 75. Like, when you're taking shots like that, you're probably getting this guy as your wide receiver 6 on your football team, wide receiver 5 on your football team, maybe even later, depending on how early you kind of dip into that well. But these are guys that could find themselves into high target situations. I mean, last year, Samuel 91 targets, Shakir 45, and that was on a limited sample size. Both of these guys could push for, 85 or more targets this year. And when you're getting them this late, I think both of these guys can be values. But it sounds like you said, due to the age, you're going to lean Khalil Shakir here, and I'm going to lean Curtis Samuel. But I don't know if there's necessarily a wrong answer here, because the reality is both of these guys, I'm not a huge Keon Coleman guy either. Both of these guys could potentially be the number 1 and the number 2 fantasy football wide receivers this year during 2024.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, man. Well, let's move on to our next team here. This question more is about who is going to be the number 1 wide receiver here for the Carolina Panthers. And we're going to be debating between Xavier Legette and Diontae Johnson. Obviously, we all know Legette drafted in the first round this year. They traded up with the Buffalo Bills to go get Legette. He's 23 years old. On Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 45. On Sleeper, the wide receiver 42. You also look at Diontae Johnson right now. He is being drafted almost exactly similar, but he's 28 years old, the wide receiver 47 on Keep Trade Cut, and the wide receiver 49 on Sleepers. So my question to you is, who are we drafting? Who are we taking? And who is the true number 1 wide receiver here for the Carolina Panthers?
I'm taking Diontae Johnson, and he is and will be the number 1 wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers. Pro Football Focus, he's ranked as the 35th wide receiver, and Fantasy's Pros, he's ranked as the number 40 wide receiver. Diontae Johnson, there's no real credible threat in that wide receiver room for those vacated targets. We had Adam Thielen was getting targeted like crazy last, so now you bring over Diontae Johnson, and he's going to be getting the lion's share of those targets. Xavier Legette, I'm not a huge believer in him either, and I think this is a perfect situation for DJ, especially if Bryce Young steps up. He maintained productivity last season in Pittsburgh despite the injuries, despite the quarterbacks changing, despite the change of offense throughout the season. So he was able to do that over there. Now he comes over here where he's going to be targeted like crazy, and pretty much a scenario where the only way that that's not going to happen is if Xavier Legette exceeds expectations.
Fair enough. I mean, I look at what Diontae Johnson has done there in Pittsburgh over the last couple of seasons. 2021, 169 targets. You talked about him being a target monster. That is an insane amount of targets for a wide receiver. Then the year after that, 2022, 147. Last year, 87. A little bit of a down year for Diontae Johnson. He was injured. He missed some time. Obviously, we know the quarterback play, Mason Rudolph, some of these other guys that were under center. Not the greatest there in Pittsburgh. But I still look at what he's been able to do. And I think some of the question marks about Diontae Johnson that we kind of brought it up on a BDGE video the other day. He's not really a guy that ever sees the red zone. He doesn't score a lot of touchdowns. He does get a lot of receptions. So maybe in your PPR leagues, that's where his value is. In a half point or maybe a standard league, you're not getting a lot of that. But I will say, again, I'm going to disagree with you. And really the reason why, and this might actually shock you because I have not necessarily been the biggest Legette fan either. It's funny, we talk about these rookies so far, Keon Coleman, Legette. These are kind of two guys that I've been a little bit lower on than consensus over our draft process. But I just look at some of the stuff that Legette has going for him right now. And coming off of a 2023 season where he was a late breakout in college. Obviously, sometimes you don't want to see that late breakout, but 2023, 71 receptions, 1,255 yards, a 23.6% target share, 22 years old. I think the big thing for me is now that he's 23 in the NFL as a rookie, coming off the board as wide receiver 45, and then the fact that Diontae Johnson is wide receiver 47, the fact that they're so close to each other, and I get that 4 years of difference or that 5 years of age difference in a guy like Xavier Legette, whereas I feel like I've already seen kind of what the ceiling of a Diontae Johnson can be. And even though that was a great fantasy football wide receiver, we talk about 2021 where he saw 17 fantasy points per game. He was a top 8 guy in fantasy points per game. I just think the ceiling for a guy like Legette at this point in their careers, I'm probably going to make the bet over there. And I have a quote here from Dave Canales, the head coach of the Carolina Panthers, and kind of talks about what he saw on tape when they were scouting Xavier Legette and why this was a guy that they felt like they had to go get. I'm watching this Carolina Panthers behind the scenes of their like whole offseason, and they called him a conviction player. This is a guy that they felt like they had to get. He was one of their best players on their board, and he says this is a guy that watching him on tape, he jumped out or jumped off of the screen. They liked the way that he was used out of the backfield. They use him on jet sweeps, short crossers, perimeter screens, down the field posts. He said there's really isn't much else that we're going to be doing with wide receivers like this, and he's done it all. So if he is going to continue to use Legette in that out of the backfield jet sweep, short crosser, perimeter screen, that short kind of to the line of scrimmage role where that kind of feels a little bit like they'll use him as a big slot or a power slot at the wide receiver level. You look at his reception perception profile, and the best routes that Legette runs are those ones that are close to the line of scrimmage. He has a 100% success rate in college in 2023 in the flat routes. He has an 80% success rate on slants, a 100% success rate on screens. He's a 76.9% success rate on digs. He is a receiver that is going to excel at the line of scrimmage. And I think for me, this is more so me betting on one, like I mentioned, he's the younger guy, and I feel like we've seen the ceiling of Diontae Johnson, but I'm also going to trust Dave Canales as a head coach and almost expect that he gets the best out of Xavier Legette. And at this cost where they're the exact same in draft capital, just give me the younger guy that I can build my dynasty roster around. Kind of similar to how you felt about Khalil Shakir.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. This is more like the inverse of the Shakir and Curtis Samuel thing. Just lean with the younger guy, has more lane to develop than DJ. But yeah, for me, I'm going with the consistency of DJ. I feel like at worst, he'll be a wide receiver 3, and that's if everything goes wrong. If everything goes wrong, he's a wide receiver 3, and that's not even baking in a step forward by Bryce Young. So I don't think it could go wrong either. Like, you're always going to lean towards the potential of the rookie, especially given the things that Coach Dave Canales said. But as far as like just grounds and just consistency and kind of knowing what you're going to get, I think DJ has to safe bet, and I think that it's a good chance that he's going to outperform what he did in Pittsburgh last season.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, I love Diontae Johnson. I have Diontae Johnson on a couple of my dynasty teams as well. Some decent exposure to him in my leagues. But in that same documentary that I'm talking about, that behind the scenes, they actually talked about the trade for Diontae Johnson, and they said that they felt like they were trading for an alpha. So they are talking about him as if he's the number one guy in this offense, at least for right now.
Yeah.
I mean, let's move on to the next one. This is one where I think we'll probably actually agree here. We're going to move on to the Denver Broncos, and more specifically, what are they going to be doing at their wide receiver 2 job? Because I think we kind of agree, and at least for the most part, ADP is telling us that Courtland Sutton is the number 1, but the number 2 role is kind of being debated between dynasty managers. There's some people in here who like Marvin Mims. They like the tape that he had last year. There's also some people that like Troy Franklin. And you look at the data, wide receiver 58 on keep trade cut, wide receiver 52 for Troy Franklin, and then Marvin Mims, wide receiver 70 on KTC, wide receiver 73 on Sleeper for Marvin Mims there. So how are we feeling about this wide receiver room? Who are you taking really as the second receiving option here in Denver?
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely leaning Troy Franklin. First and foremost, I feel like Troy Franklin, he deserved to be drafted higher than what he was. He slid a little bit, and even like during the draft, me or you didn't necessarily know why that was happening. And then there's the obvious Bo Nix being his college teammate is also going to be the likely starter here in Denver. Pro Football Focus, he's ranked the 79th wide receiver, and I do need to point out, and I should have did it for our last 2 wide receiver rooms, the data from Pro Football Focus is non-Superflex, and the data from Fantasy Pros is PPR and Superflex. So there's a big disparity because he's wide receiver 59, which puts him around the same range as keep trade cut and other data. So that sounds about right. night. But I think Troy Franklin, he just has opportunity. Sean Payton, he's a guy that Sean Payton brought in. Marvin Mims, he was here a year before, but they're kind of looking at this as like the beginning of the new era for the Denver Broncos here at Bo Nix. And I think Troy Franklin is a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Really, for me, it's this. There's not a lot of data to back up either of these guys for the most part, because obviously we haven't seen Troy Franklin at the NFL level. We also really haven't seen Marvin Mims at the NFL level too much. You look at what he did last year, 16 games played, 33 targets, 377 receiving yards, 1 touchdown. There's just not a lot to see on the NFL fields for either of these guys. But I will say, I've talked a lot about Troy Franklin this offseason. Yeah. If it gives anybody any type of insight as to how I feel about this guy, I have like 60% exposure. And for those of you that don't play best ball, 60% exposure to one player in a best ball format is insane. That's like 6 out of 10 drafts, you're drafting this player on your team. And I have 60% exposure to Troy Franklin right now. I think he is a player that is, like you said, for whatever reason, been kind of disrespected in the draft process for whatever reason. Early on, before we really got into a lot of the draft stuff, like I had him as high as my wide receiver 5. Now, obviously things happen, draft capital changes that, and you adapt your rankings over time, but this is still a guy who I think is very talented. I look at his kind of role that he played at Oregon, and I also kind of look at the projected role that I see him playing potentially here in Denver. I think we all kind of have to agree for the most part that Courtland Sutton, as long as he's there, he's going to be the X wide receiver. He's going to be the number 1 guy on the outside. But I think that Troy Franklin, I'm going to kind of deem him as a flanker or a Z type wide receiver that has X wide receiver potential long-term if they can help develop him. He actually kind of reminds me a lot of early on, like coming out of Maryland, Stephon Diggs. That's the way that I view Troy Franklin. And not to say that he's ever going to be Stephon Diggs at the next level, but he's a guy that I have a lot of conviction in. And I'm definitely leaning him in this, because you look at those success rates that he had there at Oregon, 72nd percentile against zone, 58th against man. Nothing that's like crazy elite. The zone coverage percentile, that's pretty solid. The man, it's above average. Like everything about him is good or better. And so I just don't think I can say the same things about Marvin Mims. I think Marvin Mims could be maybe fine potentially in this offense, but I just don't expect him to ever be great. Troy Franklin, I see the upside. I think he could be a very good wide receiver at some point in his career. Maybe not early on. And then, like you said, we're not even talking about the potential connection that he's going to carry over from Oregon with Bo Nix under center.
All right, well, I can't make it too far into a video before I say something crazy. So I mean, that apparently I'm not good at backing it up, but I personally feel like Troy Franklin has a chance to overtake Courtland Sutton to be the top dog in Denver. I think that potential is there. That's why I said it was so crazy that he didn't get drafted higher, because I felt like he had the potential to be drafted higher. But fortunately for the Broncos, they were able to make that pairing between he and his college teammate. I think he'll have all the opportunity in the world to go out there and prove himself that he should be the number 1 receiving option on that team. I mean, we're not too far from a time where there were rumors about Courtland Sutton being moved. So I don't think there's anything. Let's look at both of these guys. I think the best case scenario that Sean Payton and the Denver Broncos would love to play out is for Troy Franklin to be so great that he overtakes Courtland Sutton, and for Marvin Mims to be good enough to be that second wide receiver. I'm pretty sure that that's what they would be shooting for in this offense. But yeah, I think we're on the same page as far as what we believe Troy Franklin can do, and I think that he's going to have a pretty solid season for the Denver Broncos.
Yeah, man. I love Troy. Yeah, I agree. I love Troy, and it even takes me back. I'll talk about another guy that kind of had something similar in today's video, but takes me to that draft call. I saw the draft call that Bo Nix made to Troy Franklin after he was selected, and Troy Franklin was basically saying they fucked up. The NFL fucked up. Like, they let me fall too far. They let me reunite with you. It's time. It's time to come to Denver and get to work. So if he kind of keeps that same chip on his shoulder, we've seen guys, I mean, you hear the constant chips, like you'll hear Amon-Ra St. Brown, like he can name every wide receiver that was drafted before him. You get those guys that kind of fall in the NFL draft. Stephon Diggs was one of those guys too. He fell in the NFL draft kind of due to character concerns, I think, which maybe the character concerns did have some truth to them. Maybe, but he's been a hell of a wide receiver anyway. So I don't think that I should. I know some people really put a lot of weight into that draft capital, but we've seen people get it wrong. And I'm not sitting here to toot my own horn, but like Amon-Ra St. Brown, he was a guy that I was a lot higher on. I remember having conversations with Brandon, one of our close friends, where I was like, look, I really like this Amon-Ra St. Brown kid, but the NFL like let him fall crazy far. And I don't really understand why, because I like what he put on tape at USC and he turned into kind of a dog. So I'm not going to say that I have the same feeling with Troy Franklin, but this is one of those rare situations where, and I won't say rare, it's not like I'm an NFL scout by any means, but like this is one of those situations where I watch the tape and I'm like, man, I'm really impressed with this guy. And then the NFL draft comes around and it's like, wait, why did that happen? I don't understand why this happened. So this is one of those situations. We'll see if it turns out well for Troy Franklin, or maybe the NFL is right and this is a guy who's just an average receiver as what he was drafted by. But I also kind of have a hunch that if Troy Franklin was drafted like 3 picks earlier, because he would have been a 3rd round pick if he was drafted like 3 or 4 picks earlier, I feel like the NFL would be acting a little bit different about him, and the fantasy football community would be acting a little bit different about him if he was a 3rd round pick, a day 2 pick, compared to a day 3 pick on the 4th round.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they would have reacted better, man. I can't wait to see what Troy Franklin's going to do at the NFL level. I can't wait.
All right, man. Well, let's move on to a team that you and I, we have similar distaste for, but we'll talk about them anyways. We're going to go to the Green Bay Packers. And look, I say that in a fun way, but we're talking Jayden Reed or Christian Watson. And this is for the wide receiver 1 job here in Green Bay. Now, Jayden Reed, 24 years old, the keep trade cut, wide receiver 30, sleeper wide receiver 36. You look at Christian Watson, 25 years old, the wide receiver 39 on keep trade cut, and sleepers wide receiver 47. So both of these guys, 25 years or younger, only about a year apart. Jayden Reed is being drafted ahead of Christian Watson quite far. Not a ton, but almost 10 spots. So I want to ask you, how do we feel about this? And who are we leaning as the wide receiver 1 here in Green Bay?
I'll behave myself despite the team we're talking about. I'm super high on Jayden Reed. So much so, even more when you're comparing him to Christian Watson. I really do not have a strong belief in Christian Watson. And I mean that respectfully, I don't. I think the numbers even back it up. I think you see a consistency across the board from his ranking as a wide receiver across many platforms. Pro Football Focus has him ranked as wide receiver 27. Fantasy Pros has him ranked as wide receiver 29. So we're talking about in between that wide receiver 29 and wide receiver 40 range between Pro Football Focus, Fantasy Pros, Sleeper, and Keep Trade Cut. So there's a consistency amongst the community about where he ranks. And it's because he was the most impactful wide receiver in that Green Bay locker room last season. And he proved himself. He did this as a rookie. Yes, I understand Romeo Doubs is good. Christian Watson is good. But I think that Jayden Reed has a chance this season to become the wide receiver for Jordan Love in Green Bay. Kind of made me a little nauseous there, but I think that is a chance that could happen. Hopefully he's really good, but not against Chicago. And of course, for you, not against Minnesota.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is one where I agree with you as well. And it's to no surprise to anybody who's followed this channel for the last year and a half, because I've consistently talked good about Jayden Reed since he was at Michigan State. And this is a guy who, coming into the NFL draft last year, you can check the receipts. I had him as my wide receiver 6 in the class. So been a big fan of Jayden Reed. And just to kind of add some additional context on top of what you're saying, because this is me stamping Jayden Reed as my guy in this offense as well. 13.6 fantasy points per game last year. That was 26th overall. People forget that it wasn't even like Jayden Reed was the guy coming out week 1. Like, this was a slow burn. It was late in the season that Jayden Reed kind of got rolling, but when he started rolling, he was like elite for fantasy football. Yeah. And not that he was like Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase level, but this is a guy who is really damn good. And you look at the success rates that he posted as a rookie, there is a whole lot of green on this Matt Harmon reception perception, a whole lot of green. But more specifically, you look at that 71st percentile against man, 77th against zone, 82nd against press. This is a guy who can do it all. Every single defensive coverage that he sees, press, zone, man, he is is succeeding at 70% higher or higher rate against all of these defenses. And yes, there's going to be people that say, hey, he was used a little bit gadgety. They gave him some creative touches, letting him run out of the backfield on the goal line and things like that. Yeah, they created some touches for him, but it's because he's so damn good in this offense. They just needed to get the football in his hands. And I think the success rates that I just mentioned, those percentiles, they show you that even if you line him up outside as a true wide receiver without the gadgety stuff, he's going to succeed at that type of role. And it's just a matter of time before he becomes the true number one in this offense. And this is not necessarily me knocking Christian Watson, but the fact that it's even a conversation, I wanted to bring up a data chart from Ryan Heath on Twitter. So they do some good stuff over at Fantasy Points Data. There's a chart right here that I wanted to bring up because he says Christian Watson saw among the highest share of his targets at least 20 plus yards downfield last year. Less than half of those were catchable, but 67% of Jayden Reed's and 75% of Romeo Doubs' deep targets were. With Doubs' luck, Watson would have finished a half fantasy point per game behind Jayden Reed. So you kind of see on this chart where Romeo Doubs sits, where Jayden Reed sits, and then Christian Watson not necessarily getting the same type of love. But I also looked a little bit at Christian Watson and how he's used in this offense. He is the sixth highest average target distance, the average ADOT at 15.4 yards per target. He is used as a deep threat in this offense. That is what he excels at, or that is what he excels at and succeeds at. There you go. That took a little while to get that one out, but that is what he exceeds at. And that has a role, but to me, that's the number 2 wide receiver. That's not a guy that's your number 1. That's a guy that Christian Watson can be a very good number 2 for the Green Bay Packers, but he's not the number 1. And that's Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed's success rates, the things that we've seen him do last year as a rookie, and whether unfair or fair or however you want to view it, Christian Watson's inability to stay on the football field for the entire season every single year, that also kind of hurts him, in my opinion, as far as how I'm drafting these guys in fantasy. So like we mentioned, Jayden Reed, he's going ahead of Christian Watson a little bit, but I just don't see the argument for Christian Watson being the number 1. I think we are getting it right in the fantasy community. Jayden Reed is the number 1 in the Green Bay Packers offense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't really add any more to anything you said because we have the same points. I looked a lot at the injury history of Christian Watson. I looked at the fact of his role as a deep threat, and I think he's closer to being the wide receiver 3 than the wide receiver 2 in his offense,
really?
To be honest.
You think Doubs or Wicks? There's a lot of people that love Diontae on Wicks.
I do like Wicks. But I can for now put Christian Watson above him. But I think Doubs is coming, man, and a lot of it has to do with the injury history because the best ability is availability, and he's been the least available of the wide receivers in that wide receiver room.
Yeah, man. I mean, whether you like it or not, we probably like it less than others. They've done a good job drafting wide receivers in that offense, so they've done a good job. But let's move on to this next team. This is one that, for whatever reason, I feel like some people are going to be offended no matter what we say because both of these players are very polarizing. So keep in mind, disclaimer, before we hop into this team, I think War and I can both say both of these guys are very good wide receivers, but we have to pick one today for the episode. So we're going to be talking about the Houston Texans and more specifically, Nico Collins versus Tank Dell as the number 1, number 2. We also have Stephon Diggs thrown into the mix, but we'll talk about Collins and Dell as the long-term number 1 in this offense. Right now, Nico Collins, 25 years old, being drafted on Keep Trade Cut as the wide receiver 17, Sleepers wide receiver 18. Then you look at Tank Dell. This is a guy who's 24 years old, wide receiver 19 on Keep Trade Cut, wide receiver 22 on Sleepers. So they're very close to each other. In Sleeper drafts, they're only being drafted about 4 or 5 wide receivers apart. On Keep Trade Cut, they're only, 1 wide receiver apart? Like 2 wide receivers apart? They're back-to-back in ADP, and that's why I wanted to talk about this long term. So who do you believe is the guy to own here in Houston?
This is a really tough one because not only are they neck and neck on Keep Trade Cut and Sleeper, they're neck and neck on Pro Football Folks, they're neck and neck on Fantasy Pros, they're neck and neck in real life. Tank Dell and Nico Collins had identical production when both of them were on the field at the same time last season. Their production was very identical. That's why it's hard to determine which one of these guys is the guy. And I got a feeling that we're going to have separate guys because I'm rolling with Tank Dell. Tank Dell is the wide receiver 20. Pro Football Focus, the wide receiver 23 at Fantasy Pros. And the reason I want to roll with Tank Dell is because I feel like he excels in an area that Nico Collins does not excel. He's boom, over-the-top guy. And that's what I like about Tank Dell in this offense. I feel like this report, it's really like 1A, 1B type of situation. Maybe Stephon Diggs is 1C. You can't go wrong with either one of these guys. guys. I just lean Tank Dell because, and I already know I think I already know who you're going to go with because we've talked about this before, but I just lean Tank Dell, man. I think that he's the guy. I don't think he'll be a number one for them. It's so difficult, bro. Oh, it's so difficult. I'm going Tank Dell, though, man. I'm going Tank Dell because I feel like Tank Dell in the game of fantasy football gives me a better shot at a random 50-point game, okay? I feel like that's Tank Dell.
Look, there isn't a wrong answer, so don't feel pressured into thinking you're making the bad decision because I am going Nico Collins. Now, I will say, Tank Dell last year, I just wanted to throw the stat line out there for people. 11 games played. He missed some games at the end of the year because of that broken fibula, I think is what it was. 75 targets, 47 receptions, 700 yards, 7 touchdowns, 15 fantasy points per game. It was 18th overall in the NFL. So great season for a rookie in Tank Dell. Now I am leaning Nico Collins. And the reason why I'm going Nico Collins is, yes, he is older. He's 25 years old, but 3 years into the NFL, he has 3 years of experience on Tank Dell, but he's only a year older. That kind of tells you that Tank Dell was an older rookie coming in. I also look at what he did last year. 109 targets, 80 receptions, almost 1,300 yards, 8 touchdowns, 17.4 fantasy points per game, good for 7th in the NFL. But more specifically, there's a couple things that I think point to him being the number one, at least in my opinion. You look at his success rates last year against man, zone, and press coverage, and holy hell was Nico Collins one of, if not the best separator, one of the best separators in the entire NFL, because he posted a 77.6% success rate versus man, which put him in the 94th percentile against man coverage in the NFL. Now, against press coverage, an 82.5% success rate, the 96th percentile in the NFL. When you were posting 95th or 94th and 96th percentiles against man and press, that tells me that you are a fucking X wide receiver. You are the number one guy on this offense. Now, the zone coverage, 62nd percentile. So nothing crazy, not horrible. I mean, it wasn't, he's still succeeding at a 79.9% success rate against zone, but, above average, I guess, at the zone coverage. But outside is the number one. This guy was elite. And I also want to bring up this chart by Fantasy or Football Insights on Twitter. This is receiving splits against single versus two high defenses since the start of 2022. And you see these circles here. There's some fun poking at the names of them, but Impossible probably isn't human. Tyreek Hill is a fucking monster. Then you have receivers who are elite in this circle. Look at the names in this blue circle right here. Puka Nacua, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Nico Collins, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb. Those are the names. Now, in that receivers who are really, really good, Tank Dell also finds himself in there. So I think both of these guys are very, very good wide receivers, but I think that Nico Collins is the number one. He's just a little bit more successful outside. He has a little bit more experience. And also, by the way, they chose to pay him a bag of money to give him an extension here just a couple weeks ago. So I think long-term, Tank Dell, Nico, these are the guys. We know Stefon Diggs, he's there on a 1-year deal. I think this is to try and capitalize on a Super Bowl potentially. But I think, at least in my opinion, this year, Stefon Diggs is going to hurt Tank Dell more than he hurts Nico Collins. I think that Collins and Diggs will be on the outsides, Dell potentially on those 3 wide receiver sets. Maybe even Diggs plays in the slot at times and Dell's on the outside is kind of like a deep threat. It's going to be interesting to see, but I think long-term, both of these guys are going to be probably top 24 wide receivers for a very long time, as long as they're attached to CJ Stroud. But for now and for the foreseeable future, if I have to pick one today, give me Nico Collins.
Yeah, and that's kind of what made this difficult for me too, because we had this conversation before. Because if you remember, initially, I thought that the addition of Stefon Diggs would hurt Nico Collins. But then you explained to me that even though from the naked eye, that it might seem like that would be the case. In reality, it's actually Tank Dell and Stefon Diggs that occupy some of the same real estate. So That's what made it kind of hard. I guess I like Tank Dell a little bit more as a prospect, but you can't deny the numbers. Like, I think you can't go wrong with either. I think that Nico Collins is built a little bit more to be that X, but Tank Dell is just one of those guys where he's just the more like explosive, like a fantasy friendly as it seems player.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. And like I said, both of these guys are elite, but it seems like Nico Collins has a lot going for him. He definitely, and maybe you don't feel the same way, but he feels like the safer pick of the two. Like, if you have to make a safe choice, he feels like the safer guy.
Yeah, I can see that. I can understand why. For several reasons, I can understand why.
The contract and some of the other stuff.
Contract, one guy got injured at the end of the year, then got shot. So, yeah, there's a lot of reasons to feel like that Nico might be the safer pick.
Fair enough. Our friends at Underdog Fantasy are the #1 place for daily fantasy sports. You can now play their fantasy pick'em game, which lets you pick higher or lower on your favorite players from any sport. All you have to do is make your picks and watch the money multiplier increase for maximum winnings. The app is super user-friendly, making it very easy to use, and when you sign up using code LEAGUEFFB, you will be directly supporting our show. Not only that, but Underdog will give you a new customer special, which is a free square for your first pick'em entry, and they will match your first deposit up to $100, giving you double the cash to play with. So if you want to support our show and get in on some daily fantasy sports action, click the link in our description and sign up for Underdog Fantasy using code LEAGUEFFB. So thank you again for our sponsors over at Underdog Fantasy. And with that out of the way, let's get back into the action. Well, let's move on to another team here. We are going to be talking about the wide receiver 2 role for the Indianapolis Colts, or at least their fantasy wide receiver 2. We're going to talk Adonai Mitchell or Josh Downs. Right now, Adonai Mitchell, obviously he is the rookie that they drafted in the second round of the NFL draft. He's 21 years old, being drafted as the wide receiver 44 on Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 46 on Sleeper. And Josh Downs, a little bit further down the board, not too much further down the board, but 21 years old or 22 years old, the wide receiver 53 on Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 53 on Sleeper. So the same for both of those. War, how are we feeling right now about Adonai versus Josh Downs?
So with Adonai Mitchell, kind of goes back to like the Trey Franklin thing. Like, why is he falling? Why is he falling? And a lot of the reason he fell is because of all the pre-draft stuff, the pre-draft things that came out about him. I think, correct me, they said that he had some type of condition. I can't remember what it was.
He had problems monitoring his blood sugar, which left him irritable and ornery or whatever, and angry and whatever. There's some bullshit, whatever.
Yeah. But personally, if it doesn't feel like that would be enough to tank somebody's draft stock the way his tank. Because we're talking about a guy that was ranked pretty highly amongst after those 3 main guys. I think a lot of people, correct me if I'm wrong, you were one of them that had Adonai Mitchell as maybe like number 4 after those first 3.
I had him in the same tier going into the NFL draft before we got draft capital, before we got landing spots, just as pure prospects. I had him in the same conversation as Brian Thomas Jr. And Brian Thomas Jr. was a first-round pick, and most people in fantasy football drafts and in the NFL draft. So I had him in that same conversation.
Yeah. I think Adonai Mitchell could be, I'm 100% sure he's more talented than Alec Pierce. He's very likely to be more talented than Josh Downs. But I would go as far as to say that he's probably the most talented wide receiver on the Colts. And that means even more so than Michael Pittman. But talent doesn't always translate to production. So I'm not saying, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that he's better than Michael Pittman. I'm saying that talent-wise, if he ended up being better than Michael Pittman, I wouldn't be surprised. He is the number 65 ranked wide receiver on Pro Football Focus and the number 53 ranked wide receiver on Fantasy Pros. I think that, and the reports from camp have been great. They said he's looked pretty damn good. I think that he has a sure shot to overtake Josh Downs. Don't think he's overtaken Michael Pittman, not this season as a rookie, but I do think that he could be the number 2 wide receiver going into the season. I really do believe that.
Yeah, man, I agree with you. Look, I'm taking Adonai Mitchell over Josh Downs right now, and this is not a knock on Josh Downs. We've said it. Josh Downs is a fantastic wide receiver. I mean, coming out of North Carolina, he was a very good player. He profiles as a slot wide receiver only, and I think that's part of the issue. Is not that that's bad, because sometimes the slot wide receiver role, depending on the offense you are in, depending on the X and the Z wide receiver in the offense, that slot wide receiver role can have value for fantasy football. But when you are the slot and the X and the Z are Michael Pittman Jr. and Adonai Mitchell, it's a little bit harder to get those targets when those guys are on the outside. Now, Adonai, he's a guy who some people knock the analytical profile for Adonai Mitchell coming out. And the reason why they did that was because 2 years at Georgia didn't really perform a lot. He had 29 receptions as a freshman, 9 receptions in 5 games as a sophomore, and then as a junior he transferred. He goes to Texas. He plays with Quinn Ewers, Xavier Worthy, all of those guys over there, Jonathan Brooks, and he has a breakout year. 845 yards, 55 receptions, 11 touchdowns, and kind of performed very, very well. It was his best college season. Now, as a true junior, comes out, goes to the NFL draft, and you probably remember, a lot of people who were in the draft process at the time remember, when you watch the tape of Adonai Mitchell, the tape didn't match the analytical profile, because when you watched him, it was like, holy hell, this guy kind of reminds me of CD Lamb. Like, that is the type of wide receiver that I feel like I'm watching on the screen, is early shades of Oklahoma CD Lamb. Now, obviously, that's a whole different beast. CD Lamb was a monster. Adonai Mitchell, when he shows you stuff like that, and you see at Texas in his junior season posting 84th percentile success rates against man, 83rd percentile against press, it shows you he can line up outside. He can be that X wide receiver, that Z wide receiver to complement Michael Pittman Jr., and he can be very successful in that type of role. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what happens this year with Pittman. He obviously signed the extension. I love Pittman as a player. I think he is great. Anthony Richardson obviously going to be back under center. What is that going to look like? But I think he's a very talented player. The whole situation is probably murkier than what I wanted coming into the NFL draft, and not in a negative way for the most part. But like I mentioned, I thought this was a guy who was a first round lock. Like, I thought this is a guy who could potentially be a Kansas City Chief, could potentially be a Buffalo Bill. And if he was the Buffalo Bill or the Kansas City Chief rookie wide receiver, I think we would have been talking about Adonai Mitchell as like right behind Rome Odunze in rookie drafts almost. Like, it would have been the big three and then Adonai probably. For most people. So that's the talent that he has. We'll see what happens. Everything you hear coming out of camp right now is how Adonai Mitchell, I mean, we did an OTAs video about how Adonai Mitchell has been exploding in Colts camp. And also, I said I'd mention another wide receiver that kind of has done this. You know, Adonai Mitchell is wearing the number 10 for the Colts because of the 10 wide receivers that were drafted ahead of him. He is wearing his number because of that chip on his shoulder. So you love to see it. You hope he keeps that energy. But I'm very optimistic about Adonai Mitchell. He is the one rookie in this year's draft class that I have the most exposure to. I have him in pretty much every single rookie draft that I did this year. So was a big guy that I liked a lot, finding a lot of Adonai on my team. So I definitely do think he's going to be the number 2 wide receiver long-term in this offense, but that doesn't mean that Josh Downs can't be successful. But if there's any doubt in your mind where it's Josh versus Adonai, you better lean Adonai, because I think he's the number 2.
Yeah, Adonai has a chance to be real special, especially if Anthony Richardson, takes another step. Yes, it's definitely locked. 1, 2, 3, Pittman, Adonai Mitchell, Downs, Pierce. Just
see ya.
See that your slot position is going downs. So yeah, man, I'm excited to see what Adonai Mitchell is going to do, man. I think it was a mistake for 10 wide receivers to go ahead of him. I for sure know that 3 were supposed to go ahead of him, and we're gonna see. Let's see if he can fulfill this, this chip that's on his shoulder and satisfy it by going out there and being an absolute beast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move on to the next team, and we talked about them just a second ago. I brought them up, the Kansas City Chiefs. We're going to talk about who is the wide receiver 1 long-term, because we have Xavier Worthy and Rashee Rice right now kind of being debated. You have Worthy as the wide receiver 28 on Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 24 on Sleeper, and then you have Rashee, who is obviously 3 years older. He is the wide receiver 33 on Keep Trade Cut and the wide receiver 33 on Sleeper. So most people are choosing to draft Worthy as the number 1 wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs. Do you agree with this, War?
Okay, so let me start by prefacing everything I say is through the prism of no prison. So the prism of no prison and Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice, both on Pro Football Focus and Fantasy Pros, ranked as the number 26 wide receiver. Okay? Rashee Rice has already proven himself in the NFL. I know fantasy football is a game of hypotheticals when it comes to rookies. Yes, it's easy to envision Xavier Worthy being in Kansas City, catching deep bombs from Patrick Mahomes. But you know who's going to be next to him? Also reaching up, trying to catch that deep bomb? He's a guy from Hollywood. His last name is Brown. And I feel like they're operating in the same. I know there's room for all 3 of them, but they both do the same thing. Am I right or am I wrong, Andrew? Both of those guys
Hollywood and Hollywood and Worthy, they feel very similar.
Yeah, they're burners. Rashee Rice, I feel like he's capable of doing more at different levels than Xavier Worthy. Now, I'm not saying Xavier Worthy isn't going to be good, that he's not going to, come out there and give a reason for why the Chiefs drafted him. I just think that we wouldn't be having this conversation if there weren't legal issues attached to Rashee Rice. Like, I don't see how anybody, let's just hypotheticals, right? Let's just play a game where, let's imagine that Rashee Rice was an upstanding citizen and never did anything wrong. and the Chiefs drafted Xavier Worthy. After the season that Rashee Rice just had, do you really think people are going to be like, oh yeah, they drafted Xavier Worthy, he's going to come in and he's going to take over the spot, just be above Rashee Rice? I don't think so. I think people have forgotten. Despite the legal trouble, Rashee Rice had a very good season last year. He had a very good season, and he did it as a rookie. So while I understand the idea of having Worthy above Rashee Rice, I can't comfortably do that without knowing what the exact legal punishment or the ramifications are going to be on Rashee Rice's season. They haven't even announced if he's going to be suspended or not. So I'm just going with that. I'm going with the data that we have right now. And with the data that we have right now, Rashee had a good season, and I have no reason to believe that he's not going to follow that up with another good season.
Yeah. I agree with you, man. You're talking about a guy who's being drafted later than Worthy. We've seen it before, and I just want to bring up one point. And again, this is tough because we're talking about legal situations, which obviously you and I, we don't know. We don't know about the legal situations. None of us know. If I had to bet today, like what I truly think, some people are acting like this is career-ending type of stuff for Rashee Rice. I don't think that is the case. So I'm willing to invest. Clearly, I have some high exposure to Rashee this year as well too in best ball because he's being discounted because people don't know. Now, there was a time coming out of the NFL season where Rashee Rice was keep trade cuts, wide receiver 14. He was a top 15 wide receiver on keep trade cut. He was in the range with Jordan Addison, above Jackson Smith-Njigba, above Zay Flowers. He was being valued higher than those guys. And the legal situation comes, and all of a sudden we plummeted him down to like wide receiver 50. And now people are like, oh, the Dallas nightclub stuff kind of got wiped away. We'll move him up, but we are only going to move him up to wide receiver 33. And it just feels like we're punishing him in fantasy football. We're punishing him in fantasy football for off the field stuff, which yes, off the field stuff do return punishments on the NFL field, which affect fantasy football. But the reality is, like you said, if Rashee Rice didn't have this legal thing today, where would he be being valued? Above Xavier Worthy. That's where he would be being valued. He would be the number one wide receiver for the Chiefs. And I talked a little bit about Adonai Mitchell's analytical profile, and it wasn't a good one for the analytical side of fantasy football. Xavier Worthy's is the quite opposite. He has an incredible analytical profile. You look at the early breakout age, you look at the target shares, you look at the production, all of those things are great. Funny enough, and I don't want to say that it was because of Adonai Mitchell, but his lowest target share, his lowest receiving touchdown numbers, and his lowest, I want to say targets in general at Texas were all when Adonai Mitchell played opposite him. So it's not that Xavier Worthy is a bad wide receiver. I think he's a good wide receiver. He's clearly shown that he's a good wide receiver, but it is shown that when there is a alpha next to him, he gives away some of his workload. And I think that Rashee Rice can be the alpha. I think he plays that big slot type of wide receiver role. We saw him do it last year. And Rashee Rice is electric after the catch, man. I want to pull up this stat right here because it's his yards after the catch last season. He had 654 yards after the catch last year. That was 6.4 yards per target that he received after the catch, and that was third best in the NFL. He was posting elite after the catch numbers. So when he gets the football in his hands, he is elite. And we talk about the speed and the electricity that Xavier Worthy has. Rashee Rice has it too. He showed it last year at the NFL level against NFL DBs, linebackers, all of those guys. He showed it. So yes, there is some legal stuff going on, but you look at the fantasy points per game he had last year, a top 28 wide receiver. You look at the yards after the catch. You look at his role in the offense, and you look at the fact that he's being drafted later than Worthy. I'll take the guy who's being drafted at a discount and potentially be the number one in this offense.
Yeah, absolutely. And like again, I have to repeat because I know Xavier Worthy has a ton of fans. I know what he did at the combine. We're not saying Xavier Worthy sucks. Nobody's saying that. Please
also,
do not.
Newsflash: a fast 40 does not translate to NFL success. John Ross.
Yeah. I mean, can't clarify that enough. I just think we both agree that Rashee Rice just has more to offer on the football field. I think Xavier Worthy coming in, he may be a deep threat, but there have been deep threats on Kansas City before, and they've dropped the ball. No pun intended.
I'll tell you. I'll tell you what. If Worthy was the one being drafted behind Rice, quite further, I might say Worthy is the guy I'd rather invest in. But for the sake of the investment today, you have the guy who I truly do think is the number one receiver in this offense, and he's the one being drafted later. No brainer. Give me Rashee.
Yes, absolutely. If the Chiefs drafted Adonai Mitchell, boy, this would have been a totally different.
Boy. This
conversation
we would have been
because
talking about Adonai or I don't even know. We probably would be drafting Adonai over like Zay Flowers, over Michael Pittman Jr., over all of these guys in that those elite tiers. But look, man, let's move on to the next team because we have 3 teams. Now, these teams, I'm sorry if you guys have made it to this point in the video. These teams, they do make you want to throw up. I'm not going to lie to you. And if you're a fan of these teams, I'm sorry. You know, you've been through a lot of pain. I don't want to put you through more pain. But hey, we'll talk about some of your fantasy football options, whether or not they might be good or not. We will see. But let's talk about the New England Patriots. The Patriots, we're talking about the wide receiver 2 in this offense because for the most part, it seems like the fantasy community has deemed Jalen Polk as the number 1. And although I don't know if I necessarily think he deserves to be the far and away number 1, that is what he's being drafted as. So we'll talk about this as the number 2 wide receiver. But I think both of these guys could potentially compete for a number 1 wide receiver role as well. It's Javon Baker or DeMario Douglas. Javon Baker, he's 22 years old. Douglas is 23 years old. Baker is being drafted as the wide receiver 66 on Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 70 on Sleeper. Douglas, the wide receiver 72 on Keep Trade Cut, and the wide receiver 76 on Sleeper. So behind Baker in both of those databases. Now, War, how do we feel about Baker versus Douglas here?
Well, you probably know that I've had shares of DeMario Douglas over several different leagues. I don't think I have any now, but that's not by like design. That's just the way the season's played out. I'm a DeMario Douglas guy. I believe in his little 10-point games that he was putting up last season, and I feel like he can build on that. I 100% agree with you. I 100% agree with you. I think this is a 3-man race for number 1 on what will be the worst team in the NFL by far. I don't know if I'll say by far, but it could be by far. One of for sure. Polk, Baker, Douglas, either one of those guys could emerge as the number 1. I think that's the only thing. Honestly, I think that's the only thing exciting about the Patriots is who's going to end up being the number 1 wide receiver, because I think all 3 of those guys, they're talented. I feel like people have slept on DeMario Douglas unfairly the entire time. The community has slept on him. He's wide receiver 61 on Pro Football Focus. He's wide receiver 72 on Fantasy Pros. I personally have some experience with him being defected. I've tried to move him in certain leagues and nobody would trade for him. Nobody would trade for him. And I don't know why, because he did pretty good in his rookie season. And now you could assume that maybe, depending on if you're thinking that maybe, you know, he's better, like if you're thinking that they have a better quarterback room, you're thinking that is better than McCorkle and Zapp. You know, he has a chance to do even better. Anyone can lead this team in touchdowns as a wide receiver, but I do think one thing that knocked him really hard is the fact that the man did not score a touchdown last season. So I think when you're that type of player, because we've seen these seasons before, guys that don't score a touchdown or score like a couple touchdowns, they're hated on by the community. It doesn't mean he sucks. It really, to me, it means the quarterback sucked and that he just couldn't get anything into the end zone. So I'm a Douglas guy. I lean Douglas on this one, man.
I mean, look, we talked about a guy who didn't score a lot of touchdowns earlier, Diontae Johnson. Like, he's one of the guys that has done this, where he's been a more of a volume kind of reception PPR monster, but he's not getting in the end zone. Douglas, to me, he's the guy that I would lean on from an investment standpoint between these 2. Now, I will say, if it was like, I'm just going to throw this out here, it wasn't part of the thing, but if I'm investing between Polk and Baker, I think I invest in Baker over Polk. And that might be a hot take because there's a lot of people, there's a lot of people that like Jalen Polk, but I think Javon Baker has the tool set. I think he has the ability to be the X wide receiver in this offense. If I were to tell you exactly how I see it playing out today, I think long term, maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, as these guys develop, I think Baker is the X, Polk is the Z, and Douglas is the slot wide receiver there long term. So that's kind of the way I see it. But from the investment standpoint, give me DeMario Douglas. I just want to put out a couple things because I don't want to dismiss Javon Baker. He was a very good prospect, a sleeper prospect of mine. I have a couple of shares of him. 1,100 yards last year, 57.1% catch rate, 7 touchdowns at UCF. He played at Alabama, man. This is a guy who went out of high school to Alabama. Like, he was that good of a wide receiver. Then he just transferred over to UCF. But if you can go to Bama, dude, that tells you you're pretty fucking good. Now we know the wide receiver lineage that is at Alabama. But Javon Baker, I like the guy. DeMario Douglas, he's the pick. And there's really one thing that I want to talk about for the most part. It's really just, again, a conviction pick for me, similar to the Troy Franklin, because we don't have a huge sample size, a bigger sample size than we had from Marvin Mims when I was using that argument. The 78 targets, 49 receptions, 561 receiving yards, 7.7 fantasy points per game for DeMario Douglas as a rookie. We talked about Mac Jones, Bailey Zappi, these bums that are backup quarterbacks in the NFL that are playing starting quarterback for the Patriots last year. Newsflash, new guy in town, Drake May, pretty damn good, if you ask me. I think he's pretty damn good. And here's a quote from Drake May about DeMario Douglas that just recently came out. He said, Pop, that's the nickname for DeMario Douglas, Pop Douglas, reminds me a lot of a guy that I played with in college, and his name was Josh Downs. They do a lot of the same things. You can't guard them in a phone booth. They're just really twitchy and really good football players overall. Drake May talking highly about Josh Downs, very highly about DeMario Douglas. He had Josh Downs looking really damn good at North Carolina. Obviously, he was a very good player. Downs is who I'm talking about, but Douglas, same thing. If he sees that, they are going to use him the same way. Now, also in the same breath, there was a little report that came out at 32 Beat Writers on on Twitter. This is the report. It says Douglas was by far the Patriots' best and most explosive playmaker in practice this spring. Every time that he got the ball in his hands, good things seemed to happen for the offense. Now it's fair to concede that Kendrick Bourne didn't practice as he recovers from his ACL tear, but these were important strides for the 23-year-old Pop Douglas. So it does seem like he's been performing well in practice. He's been performing well in these early training camps. And the quarterback, Drake May, who's going to be there long term, says that he's a guy that he thinks he can rely on because he relied on Josh Downs at UNC, and he sees them as similar playmakers. I think this is an offense where we talked about it. Sometimes that slot role, you've talked about the 0 receiving touchdowns. It happens when your offense is that bad. But what I care about is the PPR points. He had 78 targets as a rookie. I think he could potentially have 100 targets this year as a sophomore. And if he does, he's going to have some value in PPR leagues, and maybe he's never going to be a wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2 or a wide receiver 3 even for your fantasy teams, but a guy that you can get right now in your drafts as wide receiver 76 on Sleeper, and you can plug him into your flex and get 10 points on a week-to-week basis. That's the guy that I want to invest in because it just feels like the floor is going to be safe with him. The talent is safe, and at the cost, he's the cheapest of all of these guys in this offense. So just give me the guy who's the cheapest.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have put it any better. I think I 100% agree with you. DeMario Douglas does offer a very safe floor. That's why I always say his little 10-point games, because it felt like that's what he was doing every single week, just putting up a nice little 10-point game in a bad offense. And I feel like he, at the very least, he can do that and then some with Drake May at quarterback. So we'll see. I think that DeMario Douglas is a very solid wide receiver.
I agree. Let's move on to our New York teams. We'll start with the Giants. Talking about the wide receiver 2, because obviously, Malik Neighbors is the wide receiver 1. Yeah. We have Wan'Dale Robinson or Jalin Hyatt here. And Wan'Dale Robinson, he's 23 years old, being drafted as the wide receiver 77 on Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 83 on Sleeper, and Jalin Hyatt, the wide receiver 79 on Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 84 on Sleeper. So these guys are like 2 points or 2 wide receiver ranks apart on both platforms, basically identical ADPs. How do we feel about Robinson and Hyatt if you had to pick the number 2 in this offense?
Look, I'm going to shoot straight with you, Andrew. First of all, Wan'Dale.
Neither.
Yeah, neither is the actual answer, but Wan'Dale, he's fine. That's why I lean. He's fine. I mean, he's the wide receiver 69 on Pro Football Focus, wide receiver 79 on Fantasy Pros, and I believe I have a share of Wan'Dale. I feel like he ended the season on a little bit of an upswing, so they're playing for second place, and I mean far away second place, because Neighbors is the true bona fide number 1. But if you want a distant second, we could talk about Hyatt. We could talk about Wan'Dale. I like Wan'Dale a little bit better because I like his numbers at the end of the season. I don't have too much on Wan'Dale. The actual answer is that I don't want either of them. If I have a choice, if I'm drafting him, it'll probably be at the very last pick of the draft. So, I mean, if I have to pick one, I'm leaning Wan'Dale, man.
Yeah, I mean, I lean Wan'Dale as well. And here's really the reason why, and it comes down to usage. And we kind of talked about usage earlier when we were talking Jayden Reed and Christian Watson. And actually, this is somewhat of a similar situation. Obviously, far less talented players. And I say that respectfully. But you have guys like Wan'Dale, who his role was a slot wide receiver. He was the slot wide receiver for the Giants. And people are going to say, hey, Malik Neighbors, he plays in the slot sometimes and yada, yada. He's going to be the number 1 outside wide receiver. And yes, he can play in the slot at times. And he probably will play in the slot at times. But he is not going to be a slot only wide receiver. That is going to be Wan'Dale Robinson. Jalin Hyatt, on the opposite side, he is going to play outside every time for the most part. Like, he is an outside deep threat only. And the reason why I say that is looking at the slot snaps for Wan'Dale Robinson. He was 11th in the NFL last year, 421 slot snaps. But I found a tiny piece of efficiency stats that I did like enough from Wan'Dale to give him the edge. From a target separation standpoint, he averaged 2.46 yards of separation per target. That was the 4th highest in the NFL. So Wan'Dale Robinson was a top 5 separator last year on a per target basis, which is very interesting because he didn't have good quarterback play. So it's like, if you had good quarterback play, could you have done more with those targets? Potentially, if you were separating that much. And then his average cushion was 6.35 yards of average cushion. That was 8th best in the NFL. So he gets open when he gets, when he's playing in that slot, he's getting open. Jalin Hyatt on the opposite side, average target distance. We talked about that ADOT for Christian Watson being, what was it? It was like 6th best in the NFL, 15.4 yards, number 6 overall. Jalin Hyatt, 21 yards, average depth of target, number 1 in the NFL. Strictly a guy that they just threw deep to. And that makes sense because Jalin Hyatt has speed. He is a fast straight line runner.
The burner, yeah.
They just threw it to him deep. And from a usage standpoint, we're talking about PPR leagues specifically. Give me the guy in the slot that's separating compared to the guy outside that's just running deep routes. That's just the way that I see it. I'm going for a volume approach rather than a big play. Yes, there's going to be weeks where Jalin Hyatt catches one of those deep balls, and maybe it's for a touchdown, and he outscores Wan'Dale Robinson. But I think from a consistency standpoint, Wan'Dale's going to be the better choice. And not that either of these guys are probably the best choice for your fantasy teams, but between the two, if you have to decipher, because it seems like these guys are neck and neck in ADP, you should be leaning Wan'Dale over Jalin Hyatt.
Yeah, and I also feel like Wan'Dale has a greater chance of being able to benefit from Malik Neighbors receiving double team.
Yes.
I feel like he has a better chance to do that, and that's definitely a gamble that I feel like is worth taking for a guy that you're going to pick up at the end of your roster. We're not too far away from people actually believing that Wan'Dale had a chance to develop into a true number 1 receiver on the jump. We're not too far away from that. I remember it as if it was yesterday because Andrew was saying, nah, dog, yeah, Wan'Dale, y'all overrating him a little bit. I remember. So,
yeah.
So we're not too far away from that. So I definitely think that's worth more than Jalin Hyatt. That's just my personal opinion on it.
For sure. I mean, at the cost of both of these guys, I don't mind somebody who wants to send a 4th round pick or a 5th round pick or whatever you have to somebody who has Wan'Dale and is just looking to get rid of him. I don't mind you putting Wan'Dale on your bench for a cheap draft pick just because I see those separation stats and I'm like, okay, look, if they get a quarterback upgrade in the future, a year from now, or maybe it's just Drew Lock who comes in and is a quarterback upgrade. Maybe he's a quarterback upgrade to Daniel Jones. Does Wan'Dale get a bump in price? Maybe. Can you flip him for a 3rd down the road when you buy him for a 4th now, you sell him for a 3rd in 6 months when he gets a little bit, I don't know. That's the way that I would think about it. It's a little tiny cost of acquisition. So Wan'Dale, sure. Jalin Hyatt, I'm good. I don't really want him. But let's move on to the last New York team because we're a little bit over the hour mark, but we have Malachi Corley or Mike Williams as the wide receiver 2 in this offense. Corley, 22 years old, being drafted as the wide receiver 65 on Keep Trade Cut, the wide receiver 64 on Sleeper, and Mike Williams, 29 years old, going into his 30-year-old season, wide receiver 80 on Keep Trade Cut. So a far ways behind Malachi Corley, and the wide receiver 72 on Sleeper, far ways behind Malachi Corley, but for whatever reason is listed as the number 2 wide receiver right now on the depth chart there in New York. So I figured this was a good talking point because the Jets are telling us that Mike Williams is the wide receiver 2, but fantasy players are telling us that Malachi Corley is the wide receiver 2.
Okay, I actually might have a little something to provide for this and why he's number 2 on the depth chart. Okay, so first let me just get the things out the way. I'm leaning Malachi Corley, even though I found some stuff out after this that kind of makes me question if I should do that. He's number 70 wide receiver on Pro Football Focus, number 78 on Fantasy Pro. Okay, so first of all, Mike Williams, I can't stand him. Never liked the guy, always get injured, always lets me down in fantasy football whenever I need him. So let's just put that there. So no matter what I'm about to say about Malachi Corley, I'm taking him over Mike Williams. If we were to put this between Malachi Corley and a different wide receiver, I don't know, opinion may be different, but Mike Williams, no chance. So here's what I'm hearing out of report, and I'm pretty sure you've heard of everything because you hear everything. Apparently, Malachi Corley has been getting dominated in camp by Xavier Gibson. That's what's out there. And if that's true, then can we be surprised that Mike Williams is the number 2 on the depth chart if Malachi Corley is having a hard time holding off Xavier Gibson? It's to the point that they said that the report that I read states that Xavier Gibson is pushing to be the number 3 wide receiver on the New York Jets. So that means that not only has Mike Williams been elevated above Malachi Corley, but also that Xavier Gibson has the chance to knock down Malachi Corley to the 4th receiver. And I think that's crazy because we're not too far away from talking about how Malachi Corley can be this clone of Deebo Samuel in a New York Jets jersey. So I'm a little bit confounded that now we're getting Xavier Gibson pushing this guy and Mike Williams even further pushing him down the depth chart. I'm still leaning Corley though, because we're talking about Mike Williams is going into his age 30 season. Malachi Corley, whatever's going on, he has the chance to fix it and get a little bit better. And I also seen something else that said that despite Malachi Corley being a 3rd round pick, that we shouldn't get too excited about what his production could be in this upcoming season. So there's a lot there from Malachi Corley.
Yeah, man. I really enjoyed Malachi Corley's tape at Western Kentucky. I thought he was electric. And a lot of people in this space don't like Malachi Corley because, like I said, from the analytics standpoint, he's pretty subpar, I think, for the most part. But his final 2 years there at Western Kentucky had 101 receptions for 1,293 yards, 11 touchdowns. Then his final year, he played in 12 games, 79 receptions for 984 yards, 11 touchdowns. He was dominant, but the way that he was used as a player is very gadgety. I mean, we talk about gadget players. He was like used out of the backfield on screens, slants, flats. Like that was primarily his only type of usage that he was being used. Every once in a while, he'd get a corner or comeback route, nothing crazy. But when it came to like running out routes, running nines, running posts, running digs, running curls, Matt Harmon's reception perception, he graded out red on those, which is below average. Actual routes outside, downfield, not the best at running those. But when you're using him in that slot and you're running him off of screens and flats and slants, that's when he was electric because he plays like a running back with the football in his hand. He just really hard to tackle, very exciting. He feels like a player, and I deemed him as one of my favorite sleepers in this class because if he got in the right situation with a team that utilized him that way and developed him and got him into that type of role, I think he could be Jayden Reed, Deebo Samuel type of player. Jayden Reed is probably a little bit of a better route runner, so is Deebo Samuel, but Deebo Samuel kind of got developed into that under Shanahan. Jayden Reed kind of being developed into that under LaFleur. Good coaches, good coaching staffs.
Yeah.
Now, Nathaniel Hackett and the Jets, maybe not the best coaching staff to develop a guy like this. So you hear the Xavier Gibson type of hype. I take it with a grain of salt for the most part because this coaching staff did seem very excited to draft Malachi Corley. But when it comes to Malachi Corley versus Mike Williams, I'm still leaning Malachi Corley because you have a guy like Mike Williams, 30 years old, coming off of a torn ACL in week 3 of last year, forced him to miss 14 games. He's still not practicing right now. It's just, yes, there is going to be times where Mike Williams probably is valuable this upcoming year with Aaron Rodgers. He's probably going to catch touchdowns. He'll have some big plays and things like that. That probably happens at some point. But we're talking about who are we taking as an investment moving forward in our dynasty leagues. And moving forward, I'm not investing in Mike Williams, 30 years old, coming off of a torn ACL. I just am not doing that. And so I guess by default, you have to give me Malachi Corley. And again, I've already kind of been a fan of Malachi Corley. So he's the guy that I lean in this situation. But I will say, with that being said, like wide receiver 80 on Keep Trade Cut, the 217th player overall for Mike Williams, that feels like he's been left for dead. Like that's almost like nobody wants him. And like, I'm just going to let's just pull up some of the wide receivers in that range for him. Sorry, hold on. Now it's asking me to vote on the players, which I don't like voting on. Hey, at least I'm not like the people on Keep Trade Cut that like pick answers that are wrong and try and mess that ranking up. I will just not vote, elect not to vote. But
I do that. I'm sorry.
You pick random freaking players, dude.
Yeah, but if now I know there's an option to not vote at all, I'll just do that.
It's at the bottom. It says like, I don't want to vote or something like that. You just click it and it moves it off the screen. But we're talking about wide receiver 80, right? On Keep Trade Cut. Mike Williams or the next wide receiver behind him is Darnell Mooney. Mike Williams, or the next one after that is Tez Walker, like Rondale Moore. These are the guys that are after him. And maybe this is delusion. I think of like a contending roster. Maybe you're ready for the championship and you're like, hey, I'm looking for a flex potential wide receiver that I can get for dirt cheap. The last 2 seasons, Mike Williams has been 15.4 fantasy points per game, 13.6 fantasy points per game. Obviously, and then last year in 3 games played, 16.7 fantasy points per game. People might give you Mike Williams for almost free. Like you might be able to get him almost free. And if he's the wide receiver 2 and you're a contending roster and you can give up a 3rd round pick, a 4th round pick, a 5th round pick, get him, sure. Throw him on the bench, see what happens. Because if he is really the wide receiver 2, it may be week 6, 7, 8 when he's like fully healthy and on the field. But if he's catching a touchdown every week from Aaron Rodgers, he's gonna have value.
I mean, he's all right as long as he's not in a situation where you have to depend on him. Like you said, if you could throw him in there, he could be like an occasional flex type of guy. Yeah. But if you have to keep him on the bench, you can. Yeah, I absolutely agree. A late 3rd or early 4th round pick, Mike Williams, yeah.
Throw it in there. Why not? See what happens. But yeah, I am going to lean Malachi Corley. So just to recap today, where we are at, I'm going to go through these quickly. For the Bills, I lean Curtis Samuel. You lean Khalil Shakir. For the Panthers, I lean Legette. You lean Diontae Johnson. For the Broncos, we're both Troy Franklin. For the Packers, we're both Jayden Reed. For the Texans, you are Tank Dell. I am Nico Collins. For the Colts, we are both Adonai Mitchell. We are both Rashee Rice for the Chiefs. We are both DeMario Douglas for the Patriots. We are both Wan'Dale Robinson for the Giants. And we are both Malachi Corley for the Jets as our investments in these murky wide receiver rooms. So that is all we have for you guys today. So if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit that button that looks like this. That is the best way that you guys can support this channel. Also, make sure you are subscribed because for whatever reason, there is about 70-ish% of the people who watch this channel that are not subscribed. So if you want to continue watching this channel and you want to support us, just hit that little subscribe button. Promise you won't regret it. And last but not least, join the Discord. It is free to join, linked in the description. We are in there helping you guys with Dynasty teams, redraft teams, best ball teams, everything you need, direct access to me. You can ask me questions. Last night I was answering trade questions from people for about 20 minutes. So you get that direct access to me if you join the Discord. Like I said, it's free to join. And if you guys like WWE, AEW, wrestling, professional wrestling, if you guys are Liv Morgan fans, because I've been seeing her on my timeline a lot. That's her name, right? Liv Morgan.
Yeah.
Is that her name? Yeah, I've been seeing her on my timeline a lot. These dudes are gushing over Liv Morgan. You can go follow War. Where can they find you at War?
Yeah, if you want to see more Liv Morgan and you want to see some professional wrestling stuff, just go ahead and check out the Crimson Mask show. I promise you, Liv Morgan will be some type of feature on our show at least once a week. And right now she's doing some very seductress things on Monday Night Raw. So if you go over there, just subscribe to us. 70% of the people subscribe to this channel over on us. We got 99% people who watch the videos but don't subscribe. So hit that subscribe button over there too. Hit that subscribe button over here. Just subscribe to us, baby, over on the Crimson Mask. Let's talk Dynasty. Let's go.
Hell yeah. And you may be going over to Crimson Mask for some seductive shit. Don't come over here expecting some seductive shit. But on the next episode, we will see you guys. We'll probably talk Dynasty trades next week. So we'll talk some Dynasty trades. No seduction. But until then, we'll see you on the next episode. Peace out, guys.